He killed 400,000 people and conducted inhumane experiments, including children who were murdered in gas chambers. No one could escape his grasp. The most brutal person in the history of World War II. Who was this psychopath? In this video, you will find out.
Everybody knows what the Holocaust is, and for sure, many people know that the symbol of the Holocaust was Auschwitz concentration camp. And the symbol of Auschwitz itself can undoubtedly be called Dr. Josef Mengele. This seemingly cute man was the most brutal sadist the war has ever known. He enjoyed playing the role of God and commanding the lives of others. He sent 400,000 people to their deaths and killed several hundred with his own hands. His inhumane experiments on prisoners went down in history, and he himself escaped punishment and died at a natural death at the age of 67. War is terrible for everyone. Only if you're not a complete sick person. In peacetime, serial killers only need to kill a few people to keep an entire city or country at bay. Serial killer is a national event, and dozens of detectives are trying to catch him. But in war, it is easy for a maniac to get lost among millions of other murderers. He can satisfy all his fantasies, do it openly, and continue to be considered as a good person. Today will be a real trash horror release, but unlike feature films, all the events here are not fictional. And if you didn't know how inhumane a person can be, then now you will find out. Who was Josef Mengele and why was he called the Angel of Death? What role did Nazi ideas play in shaping Mengele's worldview? What inhumane experiments did he conduct on prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp? How did he manage to escape punishment and live a long life after the war? Why did his name become a symbol of the horror and brutality of Nazi medicine? What were the most horrific moments in Mengele's life that were remembered by eyewitnesses? How did modern Nazi hunters try to capture Mengele, and what did happen to his remains? Of course, it is difficult to tell the story of Dr. Mengele separately from the whole history of Nazi Germany. So in the beginning, instead of traditional dates and facts like born, studied, married, I will tell you about the atmosphere in which this man grew up, how it influenced Mengele and allowed him to fully reveal his talent as a professional sadist. First of all, it must be said that it wasn't just Mengele who was engaged in terrible experiments on people in Germany. In 1946, the Nuremberg Tribunal convicted 16 German doctors and 7 of them were executed. If you look at the list of charges, you can find really nightmarish things there. For the sake of their experiments, these doctors artificially induced gangrene, infected people with incurable diseases, tortured them in low-pressure chambers, and castrated and doused them with cold water. But what is interesting is that, despite all the cruelty, these experiments were based on the scientific mainstream of those years. Let's leave Germany for a while and see what the science of those years was like. To do this, let's turn to Peter Talentov's book on evidence-based medicine. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the theory of eugenics became extremely popular. A new generation of scientists did not doubt the correctness of Darwin and thought about how to take human evolution under control. After all, if you can breed a new breed of dog, then why can't you breed a new breed of people? Eugenics, was generously funded by the state, taught at universities, and discussed at conferences. The original idea was that new people could be brought out by stimulating marriages between members of prosperous families. But very soon, it became clear that this path was too slow. To quickly achieve a bright future, it is necessary not only to multiply useful genes, but also to remove harmful ones. In 1907, a much more inhumane law on forced sterilization was introduced. Any doctor could make anyone infertile at his own discretion. For an involuntary operation, it was enough to deal with a person who, according to the state, should not leave offspring, mentally ill people, criminals, and poor migrants, because it was believed that criminal tendencies are inherited. Under this law, about 60,000 people were sterilized in the United States. You don't need to turn savage dogs loose on the USA. Similar laws have appeared in many developed countries like Canada, France, Japan, Sweden, and so on. And sometimes these laws continued to apply after the Second World War. In Sweden, for example, 60,000 people were forcibly rendered infertile by 1976. In Finland, marriage was forbidden for the deaf. Deaf women were sterilized and pregnant women were given abortions. In Japan, the last eugenic law was repealed only in 1996. So, when the Nazis came to power in Germany in the early 1930s, they didn't come up with anything new. Eugenics was not some sudden schizophrenia of Hitler's, but a respected scientific theory. The only thing the Nazis did was set about improving the German race with unprecedented enthusiasm. They took all the world's eugenic laws and multiplied them by 10. Everything that, according to the Nazis, contaminated German blood had to be ruthlessly eliminated. This included everything from bad habits to non-Aryan genes. On the one hand, the Germans aggressively promoted a healthy lifestyle, and on the other, no less aggressively tried to wipe out all those who were considered sick from the face of the earth. For promoting such ideas, Hitler was called the Great Doctor. By 1934, 5,000 people were being forcibly sterilized in Germany every month, and a total of 400,000 people were rendered infertile by the fall of the Third Reich. But the Nazi leadership considered the physical destruction of carriers of bad genes rather than sterilization to be much more effective. A touchstone in this direction was thrown shortly before the start of the war. Hitler received a letter from the parents of a seriously ill child where they begged the Führer to allow them to end the boy's suffering. Hitler took advantage of this moment and, ostensibly out of mercy, lifted the country's ban on euthanasia. And on the first day of the outbreak of World War II, the Führer instructed his personal doctor to create a program of involuntary euthanasia. In effect, he suggested simply killing everyone whose life he didn't think was worth living, and the money saved could be used for military purposes. The first victims of this policy were children with mental and hereditary diseases. They were sent to the so-called special children's departments and simply killed there. Very soon, this program was extended to adults as well. Special medical commissions began selecting people for extermination. This included not only mental patients but also epileptics, syphilis patients, and elderly people with dementia. But what does it mean to eliminate? Shoot, hang, drown? The Nazis approached this question thoroughly as well. The same personal physician of Hitler led a series of experiments to find the cheapest and most effective method for mass murder. Lethal injection with gasoline was even considered as the main method, but in the end, the choice was made in favor of toxic gases. From now on, gas chambers were built at medical centers in which 300,000 patients were killed. Soon the same gas chambers were used in concentration camps to destroy inferior peoples. Work on the invention of rapid sterilization did not stop either. During the war, traditional surgical methods proved too expensive and time-consuming. That's why SS leader Heinrich Himmler gave the order to find a replacement. So experiments on concentration camp prisoners began in Germany. Dr. Karl Klauberg injected women with formaldehyde directly into the uterus and without anesthesia. The procedure caused excruciating pain and many women died. However, Klauberg considered the experiment a success and reported to Himmler that a single doctor could sterilize up to 1,000 women a day in this way.
but a cheaper and some kinda innovative method was developed by another doctor. It was only necessary to use radiation, so it was possible to sterilize both women and men and without their knowledge. It looked like this. A group of people were led into the room and offered to sit on a bench under which there was a powerful source of radiation. After a few minutes on such a bench, people were guaranteed to lose the opportunity to have children. After the war, doctors who directed mass murder and sterilization programs were sentenced to death, but Josef Mengele was not among them. Now that you have learned about the state of world science and the specific views of the Nazis on medicine, it's time to talk about Dr. Mengele, how his last name became synonymous with inhumane torture and why he escaped punishment. Josef Mengele was born shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. He was the eldest of 3 sons in the family of a wealthy Bavarian businessman. His father owned a company that produced and sold agricultural machinery. At school, Josef did not show any talents, was fond of music and skiing. His father hoped that after graduation he would join him in the family business. However, Mengele's ambition was far more than a job as a truck salesman and flour thresher. He dreamed of leaving his hometown and making a career in science. To be more precise, Mengele wanted to become a respected anthropologist. He had no doubts about his future success and told a friend that one day his name would appear in an encyclopedia. Well, he wasn't wrong about that. After high school, Mengele left and entered the University of Frankfurt. This was a few years before Hitler came to power. Nazi ideas were rapidly gaining popularity in the country. But what did Mengele himself think about this? He wrote that before university he was not interested in politics at all. Of course, he dreamed of fame, but those dreams were limited exclusively to the scientific field. Mengele called himself an apolitical conservative. He did not join any political parties for a long time, but gradually the Nazi fever seized him. In 1931, Mengele joined the organization Steel Helmet because, quote, "It was difficult to stay away when our homeland could give up under the onslaught of the Marxist Bolsheviks' attack." The Steel Helmet wasn't a separate branch of the Nazi Party, but it was generally supportive of Hitler. By 1931, it had about 500,000 members, many of whom were veterans of World War I. Jews and communists were strictly prohibited from joining the organization. Mengele himself did not participate much in marches, parades, and meetings, preferring to study philosophy and medicine. 5 years later, he received a scientific degree for a work entitled Racial Morphological Study of the Lower Jaw in 4 Racial Groups. The essence of the study was that only by the jaw of a person it was possible to determine which race he belongs to. It sounds as if Mengele was already some kind of racist during his studies, but in fact, for that time, his theory was quite in line with the scientific mainstream. It probably wouldn't have raised any questions outside of Nazi Germany, which of course doesn't change the fact that Mengele was indeed a racist. Moreover, in 1933, Hitler comes to power and a year later orders to include the Steel Helmet in the Nazi Party. So Mengele automatically became a Nazi, and from that moment he has completely gone crazy. He attended lectures by Dr. Ernst Rudin, who promoted 2 ideas. First, there are people who are not worthy to live, and second, doctors have every right to destroy such people so that they do not produce their own kind. Hitler himself drew attention to Rudin's work and invited him to become the head of the German Union of Racial Hygiene. It was Rudin who participated in the drafting of the first German laws on the forced sterilization of disabled people, and this was the kind of person that young Dr. Mengele listened with pleasure. After completing these studies, he worked as an ordinary doctor in Leipzig for a year, and then moved to research at the Institute of Hereditary Biology. His research supervisor was geneticist Ottmar von Verschuer, who studied twins with special interest and passed this passion on to his student. During Mengele's work in the concentration camp, this interest will manifest itself in all its glory. In 1937, he became not just a member of the party, but joined the SS, one of Hitler's most loyal supporters.
In 1939, he gets married, and a curious story is connected with this wedding.
According to the law, full-blooded Germans were only allowed to marry other full-blooded Germans who could prove their Aryan ancestry up to the third generation. But Mengele's fiancée was unable to provide proof that her grandfather was not Jewish. The wedding was in jeopardy, and even Mengele's high-ranking friends had to step in. Before the outbreak of the World War II, Mengele was trained as a mountain infantry soldier and joined the active army in 1940. One of the main ideas of Hitler was that the Germans needed to get living space because Germany is too small and clearly does not meet the interests of such a great Aryan people. And where to get new lands? Take it away from the neighbors where inferior nations like Jews and Slavs live. And the Jews and Slavs themselves must either be destroyed, deported, or turned into disenfranchised slaves. Guided by this logic, Hitler invades the Soviet Union in 1941. Mengele is currently fighting in the advanced units of the Wehrmacht. In January, he was transferred to the post of doctor in a panzer division, where he received the Iron Cross and the medal for caring for the German people after rescuing 2 tankers. In 1942, Mengele was seriously wounded near Rostov-on-Don, declared unfit for military service and transferred to the non-industrious settlement service in Berlin. He probably would have lived so quietly in the capital until the end of the war, without having time to do anything terrible, but a year later he was found by one Verschower, the one who liked to study the twins. He was by this time a respected director of the Institute of Anthropology and suggested that Mengele go to work in a concentration camp, saying that there is a lot to do for development of science. Mengele remembered his ambition to become a scientist and agreed. So in 1943, he ended up in the Auschwitz camp. Mengele immediately received the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer and the post of chief medical officer of the camp. However, this name looked like a mockery, because the camp doctors did not treat prisoners but only chose who should live and who should die. All medical care for prisoners was provided only by other prisoners who worked as a doctor on their freedom. If the patient did not recover after 2 weeks, Mengele ordered them to be sent to the gas chamber. When a typhoid epidemic broke out in the women's quarters of the camp, Mengele did not hesitate to send the entire barracks, or about 600 people, to the gas chamber. Then the building was cleaned, clean clothes were distributed to the residents of the neighboring block, and they were washed. If someone, despite all their efforts, became ill again, the procedure was repeated. For these actions, Mengele received order. Mengele's main task was to distribute new prisoners. When the next train arrived in Auschwitz, Mengele sent people either to the barracks or directly to the gas chamber with a single wave of his hand. And he liked the gas chamber much more because often 70% of all new arrivals and all children and the elderly, without exception, immediately found themselves there. But was Mengele the only doctor in the camp responsible for the death of tens of thousands of people? Of course not. But in this example, you can see how different Mengele was from the others. While other medics didn't like the job of distributing prisoners and even had to get drunk to numb their senses, Mengele adored such duties. He even asked to be specially woken up if the train with Jews arrived late at night. Mengele came out to the frightened people in an iron tunic and whistled a song with a smile. He had a whip in his hand, but he never hit anyone. Compared to the camp guards, he looked like a good-natured man who meant no harm to anyone. But he was responsible for the fact that most of these people would be dead in a few hours. However, if Mengele had confined himself to this work, his name would hardly be so well known today. He gained a notorious reputation for something entirely different: experiments on humans. He used the camp as a base for his research and conducted procedures without taking into account the health and safety of his victims. It was the twins who aroused his greatest interest. Mengele told his superiors that the study of Jewish twins would help him prove the superiority of heredity over the environment and strengthen the theory of a racial superiority of the German nation.
The authorities believed and gave Mengele a grant to build a laboratory at Auschwitz. After the war, Mengele's assistant claimed that he did not understand how Mengele's experiments were supposed to prove the superiority of the Germans because they were conducted without any logic or meaning. He suggested that Mengele's main task was to identify the mechanism of the birth of twins in order to increase the likelihood of German women becoming pregnant with twins. However, there are big doubts about this version. As a chief medical officer, Mengele had the privilege of rescuing any prisoner from execution in the gas chamber and taking them to his experiments. Most of them were children. They lived separately, received better food, and were released from hard work. They received a sweet from a kind, smiling doctor and called him Uncle Josef, exactly until the moment they ended up in his laboratory. In Auschwitz was Freddy Hirsch, a Jew who worked as a doctor before the war and was brought to the camp on a train with 300 children. Usually, they were sent straight to their death, but Hirsch somehow managed to convince the camp doctors to spare them. It seems the train didn't arrive on the same shift that Mengele was working. The children were placed in a separate barrack and Hirsch was appointed its head. He taught young prisoners to read, write and draw. This went on for several months. Hirsch committed suicide on March 8, 1944, when he realized that the next day Mengele had ordered all the inmates of the children's barracks to be sent to the gas chamber. Former Auschwitz prisoner recalled that Mengele was an abnormal person. He could smile and ask the children how they were doing, trying to improve their daily lives, knowing that tomorrow he was going to subject them to the most severe tortures. I think the image of sadistic anti-Semite completely devoid of empathy is already clearly drawn here. Mengele believed that all Jews should be exterminated and did not divide from his plan for a minute. But death in a gas chamber was not so terrible compared to getting him for experiments. Mengele amputated children's limbs without anesthesia, infected them with diseases, treated them with unnecessary medications, irradiated them, and transfused their blood. Children had mostly died. From 1,500 of the twins who visited his laboratory, only 300 survived. Mengele once killed 7 pairs of twins overnight with a chloroform injection right through the heart. If one of the twins died during the experiments, the other was immediately killed so that the bodies could be compared. Mengele performed autopsies on living people without a clear reason, removing various organs. He removed one boy's kidney without painkillers and sent him to work a few days later. But the worst thing happened to the Hans boys. Mengele decided to create conjoined twins and sew the 2 brothers together back to back. After several days of unbearable suffering, both children died of gangrene. Another strange idea of Mengele's was to teach how to change people's eye color. Well, you understand that all Aryans should be blue-eyed blonde. Hitler wouldn't lie about that. But as a practical implementation of the idea, Mengele couldn't think of anything better than injecting blue dye directly into people's eyes, which always led to either infections or blindness. Then these people were killed. Mengele cut out their eyes and sent to Berlin by military mail for further analysis. In general, Mengele's imagination was limitless when it came to inventing new forms of torture, and his mood could shift instantly. Mengele once caught a woman who was trying to escape from the camp. He grabbed her by the neck, punched her several times in the face, and then threw her to the ground and continued kicking her. An hour later, Mengele returned to the hospital and washed his hands of the blood with a cheerful smile. In short, Josef Mengele was not just an employee of Auschwitz, he was in Auschwitz.
But enough about these bloody horrors. It's time to turn our story from horror into a detective. Mengele worked at the camp for a year and a half, almost until its closure. On January 17, 1945, when the Soviet army was only 100 kilometers away, the doctor was transferred to another camp. He took a box of documents with him and left. A week later, Auschwitz was liberated. On February 18, it became clear that the doctor's new job would soon suffer the same fate. Since Mengele had nowhere else to transfer, he stupidly ran away. He changed his SS jacket for an ordinary soldier's greatcoat and in June was captured by the Americans. There, he introduced himself by his real name, but they did not arrest him. Why? Because firstly, the horrors of the concentration camps were not widely known at that time, and secondly, he could have been arrested as an SS member, but Mengele did not have the traditional blood type tattoo that almost all SS men had. As a result, he was released a month later and his friends made him false documents in the name of Fritz Ullmann. After that, Mengele disappeared from the view for a long time. His name was first mentioned at the Nuremberg Tribunal, when the Allies investigated cases of cruel experiments on prisoners. Several witnesses said that there was such a terrible Josef Mengele. Then the famous diary of Anne Frank, a little girl who spent several months in Auschwitz and died of typhus, was published. There, she called Mengele the Angel of Death, and this nickname has remained with him to this day. But no active search was conducted for the fugitive doctor. It was believed that Mengele remained in the Soviet occupation zone and was either killed or committed suicide. Information about his death was also confirmed by his wife. Meanwhile, Mengele was still alive and had actually made one trip to the territory controlled by the Red Army. The doctor took his camp records and went back to his native Bavaria. He settled on a farm with local peasants and began working as a simple worker. His only contact with the outside world was through reading the newspapers, and it was from there that he learned that his identity was being discussed at the Nuremberg Tribunal, and that if caught, he would probably be sentenced to death. So after 3 years of village life, Mengele decided to escape the country. By that time, the so-called Red Trail system was already in operation. These were escape routes that former Nazis and SS created to help their own escape punishment. Mengele asked for help and received a fake passport in the name of Helmut Gregor, a security document from the International Red Cross, and the ticket to Italy. It's ironic that the Red Cross agreed to help Mengele because he said he was Jewish. In Italy, Mengele boarded a ship and in 1949 sailed to Argentina. In general, at that time in Argentina, a very radical politician was in power, who gave shelter to the Nazis without any problems. And by the way, Mengele's wife refused to live with him. In Argentina, Mengele first got a job as a carpenter and then moved into the house of a rich man who sympathized with Hitler. After 2 years, Mengele finally fulfilled his father's wish and joined the family business. He became a sales representative for Mengele & Sons, began traveling all over the country, and even visited neighboring Uruguay and Paraguay. Soon, he began to earn enough to rent a separate apartment and then rent a rather large house. All this time, no one was looking for him in Europe. So in 1956, Mengele decided to stop hiding, openly received a birth certificate from the embassy and an official residence permit in Argentina under his real name. Probably, if not for this step, we would never have known how the fate of one of the bloodiest murderers of the Second World War turned out. In 1956, Mengele became so impudent that he quietly flew to Germany, went skiing in Switzerland, and saw his ex-wife and son. From the son, however, they hid who this person was. He was told that a certain Uncle Fritz was visiting. In his homeland, Mengele developed a close relationship with his brother's widow, and soon she would become his second wife. After returning to Argentina, Mengele continued to live a quiet life. The business grew. Mengele bought a large share of a pharmaceutical company.
In general, not only was he not punished for his crimes, but he also settled in wealth. That didn't change until 1958, when Mengele was arrested on suspicion of practicing medicine without a license. He was a witness in a case where a teenage girl died after a botched abortion. No charges were brought against Mengele. However, just in case, he fled to Paraguay and obtained citizenship there, because he was afraid that his Nazi past might come out. That's basically what happened. The second wife did not want to live in hiding and in 1960 went home to Germany. And there, at that time, Nazi hunters led by Mossad and Simon Wiesenthal were already actively developing their activities. They collected dozens of eyewitness accounts from Auschwitz survivors and conducted their own investigation. They found documents about Mengele's divorce from his first wife, where his address in Argentina was indicated, and were able to prove that the same angel of death did not die, but enjoyed life on sunny beaches. At the request of Israel, Germany issued an arrest warrant for Mengele and appealed to Argentina to extradite the fugitive criminal to his homeland. Mengele found out about this in advance, and by the time Argentina decided to comply with the German demands, he fled to Paraguay. There, he hid out and lived on a farm near the border. In May 1960, something happened that scared Mengele out of his wits. In Argentina, Mossad agents abducted Adolf Eichmann and smuggled him to Israel. Eichmann was still the main Nazi criminal who was still at large. During the war, he was responsible for the mass extermination of Jews. After his arrest, Mengele became the #1 Nazi criminal. And he was very lucky. Mossad agents knew where Mengele lived and wanted to capture him along with Eichmann, but decided it would be too risky. When they were planning a new operation, Mengele had already disappeared. He could no longer live openly. West Germany has set a large reward for his capture. There were more and more articles in the European press about Auschwitz and the horrors that took place there, and Mengele's picture was now often found in all the newspapers. In the end, the former doctor decided that he was not safe in Paraguay either, and decided to run away again. This time to Brazil. This was not so difficult to do because Latin America was full of SS veterans who were willing to help each other. In 1960, Mengele was helped to cross the border and introduced to an elderly Hungarian immigrant couple. At that time, Mengele remained quite wealthy, so he helped his new acquaintances buy a farm, and in return, he received a position as the farm manager. The Hungarians did not know who he really was, as he introduced himself as Peter Hochweg. Only 3 years later, they accidentally found out the truth. This was very bad, because the warrant issued for Mengele's arrest was also valid in Brazil. Mengele had a hard time convincing his neighbors that he should not be handed over to the police, because they too could face prison for harboring a criminal. The couple agreed, but moved Mengele to another house away from them. Mengele's fears were justified, as the Mossad agents were literally sitting on his tail. They were led by a man who was directly involved in the capture of Eichmann. The agents first went to Paraguay, but found no leads there. His correspondence with his wife would have helped them find out Mengele's location, but they also failed to intercept the letters. Instead, they managed to find two of Mengele's contacts, one of whom had just helped him move to Brazil and find shelter. Agents followed him to the very farm where the Nazi criminal was hiding. There, they noticed a European who looked like a Mengele in general, except that he had a full mustache. If the surveillance had continued for any length of time, the agents would no doubt have identified the Angel of Death. But the head of the Mossad ordered the hunt to be cancelled. There was insufficient evidence, and the search operation was costing the government too much in the face of the impending war with Egypt. With this, the active search for Mengele ended, but he never managed to emerge from the shadows for the rest of his life. One of his former friends returned to Germany in 1970 and confirmed that the doctor was still alive and indeed living in Brazil. Then, Mengele finally quarreled with the owners of the farm. they bought a house in another city and left him alone. In 1976, Mengele suffered his first stroke, after which he lost the ability to walk smoothly. The only bright spot in his life was a meeting with his son, whom he had not seen for 20 years. This son, a few years later, describes the meeting as follows: "I saw an unrepentant Nazi convinced that he had done everything right and had personally harmed no one, but merely followed orders." It was a blatant lie. Mengele not only decided who to send to their deaths, but also personally killed several hundred people with his own hands. February 7, 1979, a Brazilian police officer received a call to the scene. A man probably drowned on a nearby beach. When the officer arrived, he saw several people and a dead body on the beach. The body of an elderly man with no signs of life was dragged to the sand. There was no way to help him. The people on the beach were Austrians, who said that the drowned man's name was Wolfgang Gerhard, that he came from Europe to visit his friends, but he had a stroke at sea. I think you've already guessed that it was actually Josef Mengele. The world didn't find out about it right away. The famous Nazi hunter Wiesenthal claimed that he had reliable information that Mengele was seen in Egypt, Spain, and Greece. Even in 1985, Wiesenthal insisted that Mengele was alive and offered $100,000 for his capture. Interest in this topic was supported by a new public trial in Israel, where the testimonies of more than 100 victims of the Mengele experiments were published. Active search for a doctor began in Germany and the United States, but it turned out it was too late. German police raided the apartment of a former friend of Mengele's, found a cipher book and several messages from Mengele. Following a chain of facts, the investigators eventually came out with a letter saying that their efforts were in vain. Mengele drowned in Brazil several years ago. To make sure, his grave was opened and the remains were given for examination. There was little doubt that the body belonged to the angel of death. The final point in this question was put by a DNA test made in 1992. By the way, Mengele's skeleton had an interesting fate. The Brazilians repeatedly tried to send the bones to their family in Germany, but the family regularly refused to accept them, so as not to associate themselves with such an unpleasant relative. The skeleton eventually ended up in the Institute of Forensic Medicine in São Paulo, where it is used as a teaching tool for students. Mengele fulfilled his dream and really made a contribution to science. I don't think he expected to do it that way, but even a mangy sheep is good for a little wool. But at the end of the video, let's discuss how much the Nazi experiments were justified. While I was preparing for the video, I repeatedly made the opinion that although Mengele was a sadist, science still used the results of his research. And indeed, the lion's share of what science knows about the medicine of extreme conditions, we know thanks to the experiments of the Nazis. And the Japanese as well, but about them some other time. In Germany, different experiments on humans were conducted in different camps. We can say that they had different specializations. For example, the effect of poisons was tested in Buchenwald, and the effect of low temperatures in Dachau. In this very Dachau, Mengele's colleague was a doctor named Sigmund Ruscher, a person also terrible and remarkable in his own way, but not as famous as Mengele. Ruscher had a clear goal to find out how hypothermia affects the human body. To do this, he conducted a series of horrific experiments. First, prisoners were immersed in ice water and watched how soon they would die. Then Ruscher began to do the same, but now the prisoners were first frozen and then they tried to save them. So the doctor tried to set a limit on when a person can still be brought back to life. But Ruscher didn't stop there. In the second series of experiments, he doused the prisoners' limbs with water and exposed them to the cold. The hands and feet were brought to frostbite of varying degrees of severity, and then they tried to return them to normal. The result of his work was a voluminous work with a detailed description of methods of saving people from the cold, and these methods are still being used today. In addition, Russia tried to understand how high pilots can climb without compromising their health and concentration. He sent prisoners to the pressure chambers and gradually pumped out the air from there to stimulate the discharged atmosphere at different heights. It turned out that people can live at an altitude of up to 20 kilometers. It is clear that not everyone remained alive after such experiments. Interestingly, Russia is not considered as a complete sadist. He was more of a classic mad scientist, and the SS leadership didn't like everything he did. Russia's latest adventure was his claim that women can give birth up to the age of 80, and as a proof, he cited his wife, who managed to give birth 3 times after turning 45. A huge amount of money was allocated for the research, but closer to the end of the war, it turned out that it was all a complete scam. Russia's wife hadn't given birth to any children. Instead, she was passing off infants taken from female prisoners as her own. Russia was arrested and shot in the same camp where he tortured Jews for several years. Sometimes SS Chief Himmler personally intervened in the course of research. Instead of a college degree, he had a Hitler book and uncompromising self-confidence. He often closed promising arrears and invested in outright nonsense. For example, the Germans were seriously forced to study how the warm female body affects frostbitten people. So Mengele is also a Himmler with a scientific degree. Yes, many terrible experiments were conducted in German concentration camps, and yes, many of their results have found their application in science. That's just not Mengele's business. There was no scientific basis for his experiments. It seems that under the guise of scientific research, he was simply torturing people for his own pleasure. In fact, none of his experiments were useful, because how could anyone benefit from sewing 2 twins together or injecting ink into the eyes? Take care of yourself and your loved ones.